So we just want to welcome everybody to the AFL's Childcare webinar. We are so happy that so many people have chosen to join us this evening, and we're very appreciative of the panelists who have come to share their expertise and experience as we try as a community to tackle what is this great opportunity, but also a great challenge of our time when it's ignored. Here at the AFL, we have worked on childcare for generations now. Our most current campaign, which is Fair Start for Children, and is a Fair Start for a Universal Childcare, we've been working on since 2016. And it has given us an opportunity to concentrate on each of the pillars within childcare in terms of where the advantages are. Now for this webinar, what we're going to do is, as you can see, we have some great panelists in front of you, and we will get them to speak, and we will also have questions and answers after that. And how we're going to moderate that is we're going to use the Q&A function. If you're new to Zoom, you can find that usually at the bottom of your screen. Sometimes if you're using a different browser, it goes somewhere different, but it says Q&A, and please feel free to throw your questions in there at any time. I know our panelists will type answers if they're very specific at a certain time, but otherwise we will get to as many as we can at the end. But I can see the numbers ramping up here in terms of participants. So we don't know when we hope we will get through as many as possible, but we will respect the time and we will keep it to an hour. We know everybody is busy. But again, thank you for doing that. The other thing is there's a chat function, and so feel free if you want to put something in the chat, but we will be monitoring the question and answers a lot more. And then lastly is at the after the webinar, we will email everybody out all the links that get referred to. So if you're keeping along with what people are saying, don't worry, we will send you an email that'll have the link that you can click through so you don't lose that information, and then be able to follow up with us if you have any further questions. So as hopefully most people that are here because they understand the importance of childcare. I think you can see it here. I got a sticker today from my 10-year-old, Mairead. She wanted me to make sure I said her name, but I'm at home working with her right now. But today I was asking her, I said, what would you say if I asked you what was important about childcare? And she's 10, and she was like, well, first, of course, was why are you asking me that? But of course, the second answer was because you have to work and I need someone to take care of me. And it just reminded me of the challenge we've had over the last few months, which is, as wonderful as she is, we're together all the time. And, you know, I'm not as much fun when I'm on a Zoom meeting ignoring her as maybe I could be if I was an educator paying attention to her. And I know that's our struggle, but I also know that the people who are going to work were having challenges finding childcare. I know people who maybe relied on family members who couldn't do that anymore were having issues during this time. And so I think it's been in our face. It's been in our face because there's more people realizing what has been happening for many families for a long time, but also maybe in an acknowledgement that we need to have a collective solution to what is our collective responsibility, and that is raising the next generation of people who will, you know, take care of us in the future, but also be the leaders and the minds that we need to rely on. And so I'm very happy that you're all here to join us today. And we're going to start with a video message, which is from starting with Danielle, who's the chair of our Childcare Committee, as well as Philson and Ywca, who are both activists. And we will play that now. And so just give me a second to share my screen so that we can hear from them.
Hi, I'm Danielle, and I work for a utility company planning maintenance work on the electrical grid. My experience in childcare has largely been a positive one, but at a significant cost. I mostly work in rural Alberta, but my employer has assured that while much little, I work closer to Calgary so that I can be sure I come home every night. I also work full-time, but at times have had to pay for full-time childcare just to ensure I have a spot. My husband does environment work in oil and gas and goes to university, so he essentially works in the gig economy. His work takes him all across Western Canada and sometimes for weeks at a time, when there is work available. Whether he's working or not, we have to pay for childcare because it's the only way to ensure that when we need the childcare, we have access to it. The alternative would be for one of us to drop out of the workforce entirely. We've been fortunate in our neighborhood to have access to high-quality childcare, but this wouldn't be possible without the high-paying jobs that we have. Our childcare bill is higher than our mortgage. For someone who works part-time or on a random schedule, this wouldn't be possible. It's too expensive. For someone who works shift work and is required to work at night or overnight, this wouldn't be possible. Our childcare is only available during daytime hours. For people in other parts of the city or other parts of Alberta, this wouldn't necessarily be possible either. There's no consistency to whether there is access to childcare and what kind of childcare is available. Childcare shouldn't be about where you live or how much you make. That's why I want to see universal childcare and early learning for everyone.
Hi, my name is Vilson Ali. I am one of the members of the childcare committees in AFL. I'm also a mother of 2 children. Right now they're 7 and 10. And as so many Albertanians and Edmontonians, childcare was always an issue for my family. And it was always hard and challenging to find affordable childcare. There was a time that I was paying, I should say 60% of my salary through childcare. And my husband used to say, what's the point of working? And I don't blame him. Like I said, so many people, I'm not alone on this. There's a lot of people out there that are suffering right now. More than me, I should say, because the younger the child it is, the more expensive it is. And I really hope right now, with this new pandemic that we have, the government, this government especially, Jason Kenney, realized the importance of working people and the value it is to our countries, to society, to the economy. To have affordable childcare is a key role of that. That's what brings people to the work. And if you can't afford a childcare and you're asking yourself at the end of the day, what's the point working if all your paycheck is going to childcare, then it's a problem in role. And there's really, really a big problem right there. It needs to be solved and it needs to be addressed because it's an ongoing issue and it's just getting worse and worse and worse right now. It's time for universal childcare. It's time for a lot of mothers out there not to worry about where to put their kids, not to worry about their bank accounts, and not to worry about that they have to choose to stay home with their children and not to do what they love, lose their careers and lose their ability to drive it and be in this part of this society just simply because she have a child. It's really sad, and I hope that's being solved. It's still an ongoing situation for me right now because I still don't have affordable childcare. And I'm even more worried now where to put my children if I go back to work. Because right now I'm not working because of childcare. Because of coronavirus, but it's still an issue for me, and it's still an issue a lot of people there. And it needs to be solved. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
I did.
Greetings to all of you. My name is Ywca Strategy. I am mother to Dustin and Yasemin and grandmother to Scarlett. I work as a recreation therapist in an inpatient older adult psychiatry at the Rocky View General Hospital in Calgary. I have also had the honor and privilege of serving my union, AECEA, as a board member since 2014. My real passion in advocacy for human rights and social justice issues, along with strong activism to fight for fairness and equality, is not new. Yet, it found a home in AECEA's Social Justice Committee. As a mom, I struggled 34 years ago trying to find quality, affordable, regulated, accessible, with a focus on early childhood education, childcare. It was a nightmare. Then I watched my daughter facing those same challenges 25 years later. Was heartbreaking. It was time for action. Since I had the privilege of chairing an ad hoc committee, we focused on childcare. After securing funding to launch a campaign, gathering over 2,000 signatures on our petition, luck would have it, Alberta elected a new Labour-friendly government, and one of our HSAA members gained a seat. She was happy to receive our petition and take it to Ledge. That same year, many thanks to AFL for striking a child care working group, many other unions were involved. We raised public awareness, collected more signatures, participated in lobbying government, and finally, we saw results. A $25 a day child care from a handful to nearly 250 centers were approved. Then Kenny happened. Will be now much more difficult to get the same respect as do the parents in Quebec with their wonderful $7 a day child care. Yet, publicly funded and regulated quality child care matters to all. So let's make it happen.
So thank you to Danielle and Philson and Ywca for taking the time to share that with us. We have wonderful advocates throughout the labor movement here in Alberta, and I know across the country, and we're very happy to have people here. And I just want to say about that last point that Ywca made about this is what people want. Very recently, in the last couple of weeks, the AFL, we had polled a question on whether people thought that childcare should be part of the COVID response in terms of us recovering for the economy. And 78% of Albertans agree with that statement. And that's really important for us to remember when we're doing this, that there's a community that we're all in this together to move forward. And what moving forward means and where we are and where we want to go, of course, is going to be a big part of the discussion here in terms of our great speakers. So we have with us Morna Ballantyne, who's the Executive Director of Childcare Now. We have Nicki Dublenko, who's the Vice Chair of the Association of Early Childhood Educators of Alberta, or AECEA. And I know it's said a few different ways, but and then Maya Roy, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Ywca Canada, is a member of the Federal Minister's Expert Panel on Early Learning and Childcare as well. And then we have Susan Cake, who is the Director of Policy Analysis at the AFL, and a wonderful person to get to work with. So we will start with Morna, and so I'm going to mute and probably mute my video, but I think we can hear you now.
Great. Thanks so much, Siobhan, for the introduction. It's really great to be part of this webinar. And I'm joining you from the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation. Just delighted to be here. Big thanks to the Alberta Federation of Labor for organizing this, and it's great to see my fellow panelists once again, this time on Zoom instead of in different face-to-face meetings that we've been in over the years. For the past, at least 50 years now, childcare advocates have been saying that early learning in childcare is essential, that it should be treated by all governments as a right of the child. It's essential to the well-being of children. It's essential to parents in the paid labor force. We heard that loud and clear from the video clips that you just heard. And it's especially important to mothers of young children who are either in or trying to get access to the paid labor force. All in all, it's essential to women's economic security and to economic growth. And we have all kinds of evidence to back up these claims. And yet governments in Canada have stubbornly refused to deal with the problem of childcare. Many have refused to even admit that there is a childcare problem. I guess we just had to wait for a global public health crisis to make our case. It took a pandemic to get everyone talking about how important childcare is, about how little there is of it, and why economic recovery can't happen without it. Of course, what governments do about it remains to be seen, if they do anything at all. I'm sure you all know that early learning and childcare in Alberta was fragile before the pandemic, and that's true for all of Canada. What isn't widely understood is that this fragility comes from childcare being market-based, fragmented, and underfunded. Very simply, childcare in Canada is not organized as a public service. That's true throughout Canada, even in Quebec. Parents in Canada are forced to purchase services from a childcare market. Quite a bit of it is of poor quality, and almost all of it is unaffordable for most families. The market-based system of childcare contributes to and exacerbates economic and social inequity. Indigenous families, racialized families, mothers with disabilities, and low-income households are disproportionately shut out. The market approach works no better for those who work in childcare. The predominantly female workforce earns low wages, and any raise in compensation translates into higher parent fees. And inadequate compensation has made the recruitment and the retention of qualified early childhood educators an ongoing pressing concern. COVID-19 exposed and deepened the weaknesses of market-based childcare. When provinces and territories ordered regular childcare programs to be closed, the sector faced disruption that public education and other public services escaped. And because of this disruption, we are going to lose a lot of licensed regulated childcare across Canada. We're going to lose qualified early childhood educators to other jobs and sectors, and a loss of spaces is going to mean parent fees will go up even higher. So what we need is major government intervention to clean up the mess from COVID and to finally build a sustainable, robust system of childcare. Childcare Now, my organization, along with the Canadian Childcare Federation and the Childcare Resource and Research Unit, is proposing a federal strategy for doing just that. The federal government has promised $14 billion in new federal transfers to the provinces and territories to help them restart the economy. So first, we want the federal government to earmark $2.5 billion of that money for the safe reopening of early learning and childcare, and for making sure that school-age children up to the age of 12 have access to care through the summer months and into the fall and winter. Additionally, what we want is a portion of these federal funds to go to improving the wages of those who work in the sector to ensure the return and the retention of qualified staff. And starting in the next fiscal year, we want the federal government to boost its annual childcare commitment to $2 billion and another $2 billion every year after, so that Canada can finally move towards a publicly funded, high-quality system for all. We know that provinces like Alberta, the Alberta government, won't do anything without a push. we say the federal government has to lead, it has to put big money on the table, and then it has to hold the provinces and territories to account. In the last federal election, the federal Liberals promised to start building a pan-Canadian system of early learning and childcare. Now is the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Morna. It gives us a lot to think about, and I like that you have a path of what we need to do. Next, we're going to go to Nicki and get an Alberta perspective.
Thanks, Siobhan, and thanks for having me on this webinar. So when we think about the Alberta context, it's really hard to focus on, to figure out where to focus on for early learning and childcare in Alberta, because there's just so many areas that draw our attention at this time. So, to set the stage pre-COVID, Alberta's really was and still is reeling from a number of cuts that happened to our sector in the last short while. Not just to name a few, is our accreditation system was cut, which monitored our quality standards for early learning and care. And then as of July 1st, our Northern Living Allowance for our early childhood educators working in the North, in Fort McMurray and North, has now been cut. So imagine some of those programs trying to attract ECEs back to their programs now when they're going to be making, a full $1,000 less a month as well. So, what I would really like to focus on is, in terms of Alberta, is the Childcare Now Morna's organization and the Canadian Childcare Federation and the Childcare Resource and Research Unit. They recently did a national study, and so Siobhan, I'm hoping that you can send a link to that out as well. And so specifically, the survey was conducted at the end of April and very beginning of May. And so in Alberta, we actually had over 1,000 people respond to the survey. So it's significant, and I think we need to pay attention to it. There were over 650 respondents from center-based care, and over 350 from family day homes. So, like I said, I think it's something we need to pay attention to. I'm going to throw some quick stats at you, so bear with me. 62% of Alberta centers reported that they were in much worse financial situation compared to the national average that reported 38% of them were in much worse financial situation. 55% of Alberta centers reported laying off staff, including their directors and their supervisors. Compare this to Ontario, where only 18% of programs laid off all of those staff, and only 19% in British Columbia. And only 5% of our centers in Alberta reported no layoffs whatsoever. And compare that to Ontario, 24% of programs reported no layoffs, and 27% in BC. And then just to take that a little bit further to the Maritimes, where the provincial governments provided significant supports, 91% of programs in Nova Scotia reported no layoffs whatsoever. And PEI reported only 79% of programs reported no layoffs. So why in Alberta do we only have 5% of programs only laying off Alberta? Only with no layoffs. So I encourage you to look further at the survey report. Within the survey, there's actually at the end of the report, based on province, is the comments, and Alberta felt very strongly. They put participants from Alberta put 240 comments, and only about 6 of those comments had anything positive to say, and that might be generous. So that might help to also paint a bit of a picture of what is happening for programs in this time of COVID. And then we're also working on a report specific to Alberta, and we'll send that along, Siobhan, as well, so that there'll be a link to that hopefully next week sometime. So I think it's really important to look at that, because the how we were treated, how Alberta was treated by the provincial government through the closure, you might be a good predictor of how we are going to be treated and how we are being treated through recovery and reopening. So where's the money? We know that the feds announced on June 5th to help with reopening that some of this funding to support reopening and recovery. They announced some money on June 5th, and some of that money is supposed to be used for reopening and recovery of the early learning and childcare sector. However, on June 29th, when Kenny announced his infrastructure plan, to restart the economy. He made announcements on for investments for healthcare facilities, pipelines, and schools, but no specific announcements were made for early learning and childcare. And I'll just throw a couple more $1 million your way. We also know that Alberta has received $45.6 million in bilateral funding, rollover funding for the year 2020 and 2021. And we will be eligible for the next few years for bilateral funding as well. And then we also know that there has been savings from the shutdown because parents weren't receiving subsidies to pay for their childcare, and ECEs weren't receiving wage enhancements. So there was some savings there, and now we know that approximately only 50% of programs are open at a capacity of about 50%. So there's still some savings being made. So suffice to say, to know that there is money, and we know that the ELCC sector has been underfunded during this time of COVID. Just quickly, I would just want to switch real quick. I just need to mention as well that unbelievably at this time, we're also going through a regulation review of our Childcare Regulations and Act. And so this started a couple of weeks ago, and it's being reviewed under the banner of red tape reduction and efficiency in childcare. And this really needs to shift to ensuring quality and what's really in the best interest of children. So if you go to our website, which I'll say AECEA.ca, and it will give you links to surveys that you can participate in up until July 15th when the consultation ends. And then also AECE's work on the regulations will be there.
Thank you, Nicki. Next, we're going to go to Maya Roy. Maya, are you able to unmute? There we go. Perfect.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to AFL for inviting me and having this opportunity to connect with you, and also to Morna from Childcare Now. Wanted to sort of take this time. So I work for Ywca Canada, but also wanted to use this time to share with you a little bit around how some of our Alberta YWCAs have been wrapping their head around some of the challenges around childcare. Let me take a bit of a step back though. So Ywca Canada, YW, along with many of our community partners, we're actually in 32 locations across the country, and we're one of the suppliers of nonprofit affordable childcare. We've been doing advocacy work around childcare for over 40 years now. And what really struck me is when one of our activists, when one of the AFL activists, grandmother and mom earlier, talked about how, you know, in 25 years from her own time as a parent, the fact that her daughter is now going through the same challenges and she feels like nothing has shifted, that really hit home with me. We've seen, unfortunately, something really similar at Ywca Canada. Many of our childcare, all of our childcare is nonprofit, so many of our centers across the country, what we're trying to do right now is trying to figure out, how do we survive? We know that already, especially in nonprofit, it's not like we have budget margin and personal protective equipment. So many of my colleagues are having to negotiate and beg one funding request at a time for bleach or paper towels, or to get ear thermometers. So we've been struggling with that through COVID and the pandemic. But then we're also seeing how this is impacting our frontline staff across the country. As Nicki mentioned, almost 98% of the workforce of ECEs are women. So we already know that we're being paid less. And a lot of the advocacy work we've been doing internally with our colleagues, for example, you know, not getting responses back from the government around ECEs who are about to go on maternity leave and whether or not they would be eligible for CERB or have certain amounts clawed back. I mean, the amount of the stress and the impact it's already had on our colleagues across the country. And then I've also been speaking with colleagues across the country around what does this mean for our parents and kids? So how do we take a trauma-informed approach, especially, for example, in some parts of the country where there has been reopening, parents are actually not allowed in to the child care center. So for example, in New Brunswick, according to their, so we're trying to figure out what does this mean for the kids, right? And how do we support the kids, especially now that staffing ratios are all that much more difficult. So I completely hear you, Morna and Nicki. It's very grim out there. So for me, I'm finding I'm always having to remind myself that some of the really amazing accomplishments we have in Canada, especially around, for example, public health care and EI, that came because of labor organizing and different coalitions of activist movements coming together just after the Depression and after the Second World War. And I think we're going to have to do it again. As Morna talked about, that policy window we're very much seeing is opening. And interestingly, at Ywca Canada, we're noticing a lot of private sector companies who normally wouldn't be interested in pushing the government for childcare solutions. I think we're really seeing how important care is to restarting the economy. So that brings me to my last 2 points. And I wanted to share with you, for all intents and purposes, how we're positioning some of this, especially across Canada, but also for Jason Kenney. Personally, I know Kenney relatively well because he was actually Minister of Education when I was running Care for Newcomer Kids in Ontario for many years and saw the cuts to care for newcomers across the country, and all of a sudden noticed, really, really specific cuts, that whole approach of death by 1,000 cuts. So, we had all of our supplies and educational materials line items slashed first. Then a year later, they decided to listen to this. They actually eliminated funds for nap time for the kids. They actually wanted the ECEs and the AECEAs that were funded for the Care for Newcomer Children program to actually start doing cleaning, and actually canceled nap time. And the kids, we got an official memo from the federal funder at the time, which has since been rescinded, but we actually got an official memo talking about how the kids were supposed to do circle time. Quiet time in a circle while we were trying to figure out all of these cutbacks. So really very intentional, very targeted cuts towards childcare. So I'm only sharing this with you because I know sort of the level of challenges we're all going to face as activists, particularly in Alberta. So in terms of the Ywca strategy, for all intents and purposes, because we're aware of some of the challenges, my colleagues in Banff, Lethbridge, Calgary, and Edmonton, what they decided to do was position some of the childcare arguments really as an economic prosperity strategy. And I understand that the strategy has pros and cons, but what we've been really emphasizing in a lot of the policy pieces is talking about how right now in Alberta, we have 815,000 kids between the ages of 0 to 14. Within a couple of decades, that's almost going to be 1 million. So, trying to appeal to some of those demographic changes where the policymakers in charge are going to be thinking, oh, those are the voters. Maybe this is a particular demographic group that I might want to appeal to. Another argument we've been sharing with them, especially if they're sort of private sector people in the room, as a way to sort of open their minds to childcare, we quote the McKinsey study. So McKinsey talks about how if we actually close the labor market gap for women, this would actually add $150 billion to the Canadian GDP by 2026. So that's, a stat that usually we notice corporate folks sort of prick their ears up and we say, but guess what? Our research is showing that it's actually lack of access to childcare that are keeping women from the labor market. So can we use childcare as a labor market approach? So unfortunately, there's the money piece and the money arguments around how to get this across. And unfortunately, there's also arguments that are fear-based. We've also been talking about how, unfortunately, today's childcare is tomorrow's long-term care crisis. Just to even get them to connect some of the dots that if we don't prioritize care work, whether it's for our elders, and I really do think that our elders deserve better, and the workers and the PSWs who are supporting them, that childcare employees are the same. So another really significant way to actually create jobs, especially as we're seeing COVID hit our economy, and particularly in natural resources and oil and gas, is there are many unfilled jobs. And we've noticed that with some of Kenny's inner circle, they tend to see our political movement organizing issues, they see it as an HR issue. So we talk about pipelining talent. Again, we don't want to sort of compromise or dilute or water down some of the social justice pieces that we want to get across. But right now with some of our policy briefs, it's just like, how do we get them to listen? So that's sort of what's been happening on our end for my colleagues in Alberta, and we're also happy to collaborate on any campaigns or in any actions. But it's been really interesting sort of getting different policymakers to actually socialize them to what a feminist post-COVID recovery can look like. But one of the few things that we're noticing, both government and activists and the private sector, that we can all agree on, is that if we don't figure out regulated, affordable, and accessible childcare, we're not going to get the kind of economic recovery that they're looking for. And particularly for example, newcomer women or women who've immigrated here under the live-in caregiver program, it's creating more opportunities for sexual exploitation and abuse of power for those childcare workers. We're also seeing right across the country that because people don't have childcare solutions, that, for example, grandparents or other members of the family are being relied on. So it's creating huge tensions within the family, and also creating additional issues as well. So for example, we could potentially say that there's going to be more opportunities or for elder abuse if we don't have childcare solutions, and people are always relying on grandparents to fill something that essentially what is the public good. So I'll leave it there, but really interested in hearing people's questions and the kind of political action steps that we should all be doing as social movements who are all in this together. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you're bringing up some great points because there is that social advantage to our society, but yeah, the economic advantage is there, and it definitely helps us communicate. So next up, we would I'd like to introduce Susan Cake, who is our policy analysis and also a parent. Susan?
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to get a chance to talk about this stuff because not only do I get to do it as part of my job and advocate for this, but I am in the middle of living through it. I have my daughter, she just turned 2. So we had a really quiet birthday during this pandemic, and it has been a roller coaster. The other panelists really covered kind of the general landscape of what's happening federally, what's happening provincially. So I'll just talk about a little bit of my experience with this. So I just prefacing this, I am very lucky. I am still employed. I have a partner. My partner is still employed. We have a house, we have a yard. So we have a lot of advantages for going for us in terms of what we have to work with in this pandemic. And it is incredibly difficult. We are basically 24/7. We are working and we are parenting. There's no breaks. And so we don't have any family here, and many people in Alberta, that's the case. We have an extremely young population in Alberta. We have a lot of people who have moved here for economic opportunities or schooling or different things. And so we end up with a lot of people that don't have like real community support or family support here. You wouldn't know that necessarily by how the government is prioritizing its funding or money, that we do have a young province that needs help, but it's true. And so we have like, for us, it's just the two of us. There is no break where both of us get to leave and kind of do something together. And so it's at first in the beginning of the pandemic, it was okay. And now it's starting to wear out because you find Band-Aid solutions for things, you know, the 10-minute TV time turns into an hour and a half. You feel horrible about it, but you need to get something done. And then anytime there's a nap or anytime there's a slight break, you're back on your computer and getting things done. My daughter now knows whose computer belongs to who and whose phone belongs to who, and she will come and she will give it to us, which is very cute. But the guilt is also extremely there, knowing that this is now her life. And so I was talking to my partner about this, and I asked him, what would you say about the childcare and like what's going on with us? And then he started to talk about how we have great quality childcare and he's so happy with it. And I had to stop him and say, no, I meant during the pandemic, because we are so fortunate that we are in a fantastic facility before the pandemic. And so we really feel like our child has this great advantage that she's surrounded by early childhood educators who are well educated. They are knowledgeable about what they do. They're respected as staff. And there is a glaring gap between what we are offering as like parents trying to work full time and what they are offering. It is very obvious to us, and we would love to get her back in, but there's also an intense anxiety about it. So we are currently on the wait list to get back in to the daycare center that we were already on the wait list for about a year and a half before we even got in. And so our lives around childcare in Alberta are wait lists. Hopefully we'll get in and hopefully we'll feel comfortable with what's going on, but there's intense anxiety of like, we're not providing great care right now. What are we going to do with this pandemic? So there's just a lot of things going on. And I'm just going to get a little like political. I am angry. I am so angry about how the UCP is responding to this. I am personally insulted by some of the tweets that are coming from MLAs that are responsible for childcare. The first being that it was acceptable that some childcare centers were going to be closing because there would not be as great a need for them after the pandemic because less people would be working. And although I can sit there as a researcher and say, okay, let's talk about that maybe you're putting your cart in front of your horse, that if there isn't childcare, then people won't be able to go back to jobs, and then they will lose their jobs permanently, which we will definitely see across Canada, which is a human rights violation under family status that needs to be addressed. And that this somehow is okay. And this kind of speaks to what Morna was saying, that it revolves around a market-based approach, that the market will simply determine the number of childcare spaces that should be made available. As a parent, that is infuriating because I have no idea if my childcare space is going to be eliminated in this so-called market that will arbitrarily determine who gets spaces and who doesn't. And I can't imagine how it feels as a childcare worker to think that my job is just, it's irrelevant and the market will have the ultimate say. It really lets the government distance themselves and the role that they have in this, and that it's another way that we really individualize the issue of childcare, that you should trade off with your partner, you should get your grandparents to come over and help, you should get your neighbor to come over and help. These are all Band-Aid solutions and they involve the individual circumstances of the family, but really we need a societal response. We need a government issue. That is the role of states. It happens in other countries. We are just not doing a great job in comparison to other places in the world that are doing much better. And it really shows that we can. And unfortunately, we might have to rely on the federal government to do a lot of the heavy lifting in this case, especially with the current provincial government. So hopefully I'll just leave it at that and I'll calm down a little bit. I'm still very angry about everything.
Susan, I think it's completely reasonable because it's frustrating when people treat this as if there isn't a solution. And I think we've heard from all our panelists today that there's a solution, there's a role that this government could be playing that could be helping us through it. and we're not seeing it. Well, we're not seeing it yet, and that's where our advocacy work is. So we have a few questions coming in, and so I will start with this one, and whomever would like to jump in. And I don't feel the pressure that everybody has to answer every question, because I know sometimes that puts a lot of pressure on there. So with the lack of capacity in licensed childcare, which always existed but has been made much worse since COVID, how are we going to prevent the rapid expansion of unlicensed, unregulated babysitting? It is already a fairly popular solution for families that cannot afford or cannot find care accessible to them. I think this is a great question. Who would like to start the answer on that?
I can start. So, you know, that's a great question, and it really is thinking about what the pulse is, what's happening in Alberta, because we've been watching some of the language, and you know, while that is sometimes a choice that families make, is to put their children in what we used to call private babysitter settings, they've now, in the last couple of months, they've started changing the wording on the government website and stuff and they used to call them private babysitters, but now they've changed the title to unlicensed childcare provider. And so it's almost like it's making it more of a legitimate choice, I guess, for families to use. And sometimes that's all, I mean, and really it is one of the only choices that some families have. I mean, childcare is quickly becoming a middle class and upper class, especially high quality, you know, childcare that's not affordable, is becoming that type of a service. And, you know, the amount, even with full subsidy, families are often paying still thousands of dollars if they have multiple children, paying that a month. So, you know, I think honestly, we do have, even though it's crazy that we are having this reg review at this time, but I think if you go in and try, and if you do feel strongly about this, go in and do one of those surveys for the regulation review, because one of the things that they're, you know, that they need to hear feedback about right now is what the importance of approved, licensed, and regulated childcare, and why you feel so strongly about that, because it is something that we have seen it's coming up, and they're starting to bring it forward as and it's not something that has to be funded, right? So I concur. It's an issue.
Yeah, that sounds absolutely true. Siobhan, go ahead, Morna.
Yeah, I just want to maybe perhaps give sort of one suggestion around the question about how do we prevent it. And I think a key way of preventing the expansion of unregulated childcare is to organize and advocate really strongly against governments putting public money to parents in the form of individual transfers to help them then go out onto the market and purchase those kinds of services. This is the approach that the Alberta government is pushing for. It's the approach that the Ford government in Ontario is pushing for. This is what the Harper government introduced when it introduced the universal childcare benefit. It's the whole notion that it's best to get out of the crisis of childcare by just giving parents some extra money and saying, go shop around for whatever you can get. So we're going to have to really, really strongly push back against that. And that means pushing for all public funding for early learning and childcare to be transferred directly to the providers, the operators, rather than put it into the hands of individual parents. You improve access, you improve equitable access by funding the system and the service, not by giving individuals a bit more money to go shopping for childcare.
Thank you. Susan? Oh.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in, and just as a parent that was looking at childcare, there's a lot of parenting books out there, but nobody after I gave birth gave me a book about what good childcare looks like. And when I talk to more conservative folks, they seem to always assume that that as a parent, I know what's best for my child. And yes, I know how to soothe my child. I know what she likes. I know all these things, but I am not an early childhood educator. And I did not go to school for this. I did not learn the milestones to help her development and to give her the best chance at life. And and when I go to a childcare center, I do not know how to judge what the quality is that is actually being delivered for the children. And I think that we really gloss over how this further individualizes the issue, that all of a sudden I am responsible solely for finding out what the key indicators of quality are. And this is especially egregious considering getting rid of the certifications in Alberta, which I as a parent used as a way to at least get this idea that, okay, this center is adhering to certain quality standards, but then you have to go into the center, you have to try to see them and interact with them. And it is a lot to take on to be the vetting for ensuring quality, especially considering that the government is giving these places money. So if the government gave me money as an individual parent, I am then accountable to making sure that this government money goes towards quality childcare without knowing exactly what that looks like and what that means.
Yeah, great point. And then what you choose becomes a financial decision versus a quality care decision, which is quite honestly what it should be about when we're talking about education. Just a reminder, if you have any questions for the panelists, to put them in the Q&A at the bottom. Well, it's on the bottom of my screen. Some of the browsers are different, but if you just want to type in your answer or your questions there, we'll get to them. The next one I have is about the $25 a day, which we referenced in the speaking part, which is what impacts have we seen as a result of the $25 a day? And I know it's only been a short time, but are we seeing any results? Susan, I don't know if you want to take that on because I know we've spoke about this recently.
Yes, so there was a formal review done of the first 22 centers after the first year. I think there's still, I'm not sure if the second one has been released yet of all the other centers, but I know every year they basically have been going through and doing reviews, and it has been overwhelmingly positive for the people who can get into the program. The families have more money available. They're able to do more activities with their kids, sign their kids up for more like sporting events and stuff like that. Far less stress. They've been able to excel as workers who aren't worried about what kind of quality daycare their child is getting, or ensuring that they have access, including to standards of food and whatnot. Just in every way that you could imagine, it has been positive. One of the only negatives is that the parents feel like they're so lucky to be part of this, that they have won the lottery, because it was so because not everybody had access to it. And there is issues that, getting into center-based care can be more difficult than getting into some of the other forms of care. And so when you start pilots at center-based care, you end up serving certain populations. And so there's issues with that. But the way that we get rid of that is to grow the program out. It's not to cut it and give it to nobody. And so the reports have been overwhelmingly great for the families, for the kids, and for the workers in these centers. And also, one of the other key indicators of any social program, whether it's a success or not, is do people want to get into it? Is it oversubscribed? And I'd say overwhelmingly, it was an oversubscribed program.
Right. So if we rely on this market model, it shows that we should have more, not be cutting that program. Absolutely. The next question are there any specific jurisdictions that have a successful plan when you think we should try and model, and is the Quebec model sustainable? So maybe I don't know, Maya, if you feel comfortable answering that, just in terms of seeing it across Canada, or Morna.
Just very quickly, Morna can probably speak better to this, but we have, especially with COVID right now, it's been really interesting. The government of Nova Scotia, at least what I'm hearing from my colleagues, they've basically put in place a number of supports where childcare essentially is being fully subsidized. Someone had asked earlier in the chat about some of the more recent studies around Quebec. And Morna actually references that in some of her Childcare Now materials, but we do actually have links to some of those studies. So I'm happy to actually pass that on if it could be emailed out to everybody who came here today, because it is a good talking point, sort of talking about how much people actually get back as a result of childcare. And it's also interesting for us as women, because we noticed there's also been some really interesting studies around how the Quebec model has led to more equitable division of household chores between within same-sex couples, but actually also between cisgender men and women, right down to my colleagues at Ywca Quebec, where they actually talk about, yeah, since they've noticed a real shift that, you know, they just fold a piece of paper in half and sort of write down all the care responsibilities. So for us at Ywca, it's interesting for us to think about, you know, childcare is also pushing for the kind of gender equity shifts we actually want to see in society. So right now in the short term, we're using a lot of economic arguments, but we know ultimately we're all going to benefit as a society across the country.
I'd like to just speak briefly to the issue of the Quebec model, and is this a model for everyone, for Canada? There are many really good aspects to the Quebec model, but what a lot of people don't realize outside of Quebec is that Quebec has actually a couple of systems that run parallel to each other. So in Quebec, there is a publicly funded early learning and childcare system, which is known in Quebec is the CPE. It funds what's called the Centre de Petite Enfance, which are really center-based childcare that also offer a home-based care. That subsidized program was first introduced in the 90s, and it made its biggest, sort of the biggest thing, the greatest thing it did was make regulated licensed childcare affordable. And it did it by putting in a cap, a very low fee and a cap on fees. And it originally started at $5 a day. So for everybody else in the country, when they heard that in Quebec, you can have licensed regulated care for $5 a day, it was just, you know, the dream that most parents were looking for. The problem with it was that the Quebec government didn't put enough public money to be able to make enough $5 a day daycare available to enough families. And to relieve the pressure from not having enough supply, what the government did was what other governments have done, is effectively offered tax rebates to families who went on the private market to seek out alternate forms of daycare. And the problem with Quebec is in the last 10 years, the public funding has fallen shorter and shorter and shorter. And that means that the private, unregulated market sector has increased dramatically. And so what we've seen in Quebec, which we haven't seen to the extent anywhere else in Canada, is an explosion of for-profit, private, unregulated care. That's a big problem. I'll just leave it at that. The solution, of course, is more public funding. That's why we call for a fully publicly funded system, because as long as there's a little bit of space for the private market provision of childcare, it's going to squeeze out the publicly funded higher quality care. With respect to the economic returns, this has been studied, as Maya said, extensively. If you Google Pierre Fortin, P-I-E-R-R-E, Fortin, F-O-R-T-I-N, he's an economist at the University of Quebec in Montreal, and he's done probably the most extensive research with colleagues. And essentially, the reason why the Quebec childcare system had such positive returns for Quebec, for the government of Quebec, is that it allowed the participation rate of women to increase dramatically. More women working meant more women paying taxes, both to the provincial government and the federal government. And participation rates for women are are very, very high relative to men in comparison to other provinces. That's how you make the childcare investments in childcare have a very positive return.
Yeah, it sounds like it was susceptible to the same kind of stress all of our public systems are, which is suddenly it gets squeezed, and then that's where we see the weaknesses, whether it's healthcare, you know, long-term care and childcare and education system. So we need to be funding them properly. And I think that's what we're seeing in Alberta, because even the $25 a day program was getting us on a path somewhere. But then now that it's being, you know, taken away, we're never going to get the density that we're going to see where a lot of people could see the success, and then fix the issues that we were going to have with it, because it was, you know, it was the beginning, not an end. I want to, we recognize we're kind of coming to the end of our time, and I think we could talk for days about this. And I remember going to the Childcare 2020 conference with advocates from across the country. And here we are in 2020. And although we have a lot of work to do, I can see a lot of the advocacy work. I know someone has asked a question around provinces working together. I think organizations like Childcare Now, the Ywca, as well as the labor movement through the CLC, and also national unions that are leading the charge on this, such as PSAC and QP and CUPW and many, many others, is how we're communicating and moving forward. And I know Nicki is, you know, tied in on the national stage as well, and that is so important, because I think what I've heard today just shows how important it is for us to come together. Our survey shows that we have 78% of Albertans behind us who want us to move on this, and so that means we need to work together. On the AFL, I'll share the link on our Fair Start Alberta. Okay, so if you push that button, it just mutes you, just so you know. We have an email here, MLA tool. Now, there's a couple MLAs on this call, so I have Janice Irwin and Raki Pincholi have joined us, so you may not have to email them, but if you go on to Fair Start Alberta, here's the link, should be coming soon, and you go there, there's a letter that you can change, and it'll automatically go to your MLA and the opposition. And so we encourage you to do that, to talk to them about what's important to you and share your story, and share that this is an issue that needs to be in the forefront, because an economic recovery has to have a feminist lens if we are going to build the society that we that families deserve, but also that we're going to need. So please join me in thanking all of our panelists for bringing their expertise to here and sharing with us. It's been absolutely wonderful. If you send us questions by email, we will get them answered or connect you with resources. We will make sure to send that email out with all these links. This is such a big issue. Fair Start Alberta is what we're working on, but everybody is doing such wonderful work. So thank you for the time. This would be when we would hear a clap if we were all in the same room, but instead go and enjoy your families and your homes, and we will connect soon on this so that we can fight in order to get a universal childcare system here in Alberta. So thank you, everybody. And thank you to the panelists.